to everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm usually not too quiet. So welcome to this session. This session, as you can see from the title, is HR and Excel, friend or foe. And I'm not quite sure when you, as you arrive here today, whether you have your own views as to whether they are friend or foe, whether they are things that should work together or should not. So, first of all, let me start with an introduction of myself. I work for an organisation called Talentia Software. I've been involved in the HR and finance industry now for over 20 years. And in the 90s, I started replacing Excel, and here I am 20 years later, still replacing Excel. And what I don't understand, quite honestly, is why. And part of the reason for the conversation today is to really explore that in a little bit more detail. First of all, I want to give some context to this presentation. The world in which we live, the business world, is changing. It is now changing even faster, I think, than I've seen during my lifetime. And it seems to be that the world we wake up in today is actually quite different to the world that we went to sleep in last night. Every single morning, there are stories, there are things going on around the world that impact us. And one of the ways of measuring that is using a marketing model. Now, we use a marketing model of PESTLE. You can see what it stands for up here. And it looks at a variety of different elements that will impact an organisation. Some of these have become more and more relevant today, certainly when we start to look at economic and we start to look at political. So when I was preparing for this slide, I thought there's going to be one or two which are going to be the primary ones. However, when I looked at it and thought in detail, they're actually all as important as each other and influence organisations today. In our view, companies, to be successful, need to be able to access more and more data that is real-time and that is accurate. The decisions that you have to make within your organisations today, you are asked for more decisions and for more information than you ever have been before. Now, that is fine when the world is stable. I don't think we can describe the current situation we are in as stable. I know there are certain politicians who would like to think that we are strong and stable, but I'm not 100% convinced, and I don't think most of the population are. So we've actually produced a white paper, and it's available later on if you want to look at it, about uncertain political landscapes. Is it a land of opportunity? Because for us, having the right tools, the right information, and the right access to that information is key for organisations to succeed today. So what does all this have to do with Excel? The answer is a lot, because over the next 15 minutes, what we'll do is review the business case, whether Excel should be used in HR or not, and hopefully give you some time individually within your organisations to reflect and decide whether you are red, amber, or green when it comes to all the things that we're going to be talking about today. So let's start this journey with a nice simple number. 88. Various studies over the past few years indicate that 88% of all spreadsheets, 88% of all spreadsheets have significant errors in them. And that's just not one report, that's several reports that we've brought together. So surely that's the end of the talk. Job done, okay? It's proof. You should not be using spreadsheets for HR data. But you kind of know that. Because if it was 30% or even 40%, you would still know, as HR people, that it's still not 100%. So once again, I ask my question, why? Why do you carry on using Excel spreadsheets when you know there's a high chance of error within it? Maybe it's because they're free. That could be one option. Maybe because the finance teams who could be funding your new systems are Excel gurus. And they believe it's fine, even though they still have 88% of their spreadsheets with errors in. But they won't admit it quite the same way you do. So how do you change this? You know it's not right, otherwise potentially, unless you're just tired of walking around the show for 10 minutes, you're here because potentially you use Excel spreadsheets as part of your HR solution today. Maybe not your core, but maybe keeping other information on it. So let's understand a little bit more about that situation. But I want to do that by stepping back a little bit and looking at technology and how technology has changed. So here we are. Some of you will not know this date, and that is fine. I understand that. But in 1987, 2 years after Microsoft Excel was brought to market, some of us were driving around in Austin Maestros. I will not ask. I do see a smile at the back there. That's one guilty partner. So that makes 2 of us. So we were driving around in that. It was the right tool for the job. It was one of the better things that you could buy, and that was fine. But if you look at the next change, the year 2000, Jaguar S-Class, slightly different, slightly more stylish, slightly more power, certainly safer. And let's roll forward another 17 years. Wow, what a change. So a Tesla 3. So Tesla 3, all electric. 200, it's an electric car you plug in at home or somewhere along the route. 215 miles range. It costs pence versus pounds to actually fill up. 0 to 60 in 6 seconds. 5-star rating. Autopilot, pre-installed for when legislation changes. And you can upgrade it via the internet. Okay? And it's similar price to those carbon-fueled cars that you can get today. I do not work for Tesla. Okay? But these changes, you can see, have been driven by several criteria. So safety, economy, technology, environment, compliance. They are now the right tools to do the job that's required today. Let's look at our friend here. Now Excel, logo's changed, it has some more functionality. And in 1987, I'm not negative towards Excel, but in 1987, it was one of the right tools, because it was one of the only tools that was available to organizations to hold data for an HR system. But as time has gone on, if you think back to the criteria here, my question is it actually correct today? For those of you who have access to maybe some form of HR database or HR system, Excel is the equivalent of an open database. Just think of it that way. So those of you running an HR system today, it's a bit like letting your managers and employees actually bypass the front end and just go and key data in the back end, okay, with no control and no security. I think the answer from you is probably no. So why do we do this today? One of the main reasons of lack of change within systems is cost. However, I disagree. What I have seen over the last 20-odd years is not a lack of funds, but a lack of compelling business case. Now, senior leadership teams within organizations who kind of don't always get, don't beat me up for this, don't always get the HR function, okay, or fully understand the impact that HR can have within an organization, they're not necessarily the right people to make these decisions on their own. Some of you will be in a slightly different situation. I know that for a lot of organizations, you can do this. But for the ones that I've been working with over the last 20 years, building a compelling business case for change has been their biggest challenge. They know what they want to do, They know probably what they want to use, but they've been unable to get that decision made within and the funding within their organisation. For us, as a supplier of services and software, no change is our biggest competitor today. And in all the companies I've worked for, it's always been the same way. Enthusiastic teams, but not able to actually make those changes within the business itself. So for those of you using Excel, either as core or as part of different areas, maybe holding performance information or training records or something else, I hope to provide you with a few tips really to include within your next business case application. So let's look at one of our modules, because we looked at, we're talking about budget, and we're talking about how budget shouldn't be important. I'm going to give you an example now of one of our solutions. Now we have, as well as HR, we also have a budgeting, planning and forecasting tool. Okay, that tool enables us to collect data from a variety of different sources and consolidate it together using workflow and different controls with security to manage your, when you do your budget, everybody will have been involved with budgeting, and then you're rebudgeting, and then you're re-rebudgeting. Yeah, that process, which is fun in the last 3 months of the year, which you never quite get done until the first month or the second month into the new year. So we manage that in a much simpler and much more consolidated way, in multi-language and also multi-currency. So let's look at a typical installation. If you take the cost of the solution plus the implementation, spread it out over 5 years, it comes to about £15,000 a year. Okay. 10 users. We work out really simply that for 15,000, for 10 users, it's 1,500 people, £1,500 per person. Divide that by 48 weeks, comes out to £31. £31 equates to about 1 hour of a professional's working time. Okay? Justifying something through finance is not difficult. That's not the real challenge. For me, when I look at things, it's not the real business case. And what we're going to look at now are really what are the main points that should make up that business case. When we started looking at Excel, understanding what it does and what it doesn't do, we kind of break it down into about 60 different components. But they didn't really have much impact. So we kind of put them together in 3 buckets that we think, not money, put that to one side, but more importantly, looking at those other 3 buckets that would make an impact into that business. The first one is human error. I think you know that one, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The second was inefficiency and poor control. And by poor control, I also mean security. And thirdly was compliance. So everything we moved into one of those 3 buckets. So let's start with human error. Now this was a survey that was done by the Institute of Chartered Accountants for England and Wales. They broke down the training that people have within business for, or have had for it with Excel. So we have the main areas here. So as you can see, from professional training all the way through to no training. So let's have a look. I think you know where this is going. So 25%, that's pretty high, that's good. But it does leave 64% of people who use Excel in a variety of different ways within an organisation being self-taught. So what's the impact of that? Let's look at Mr. Stressed. Okay, you might or might not recognise this person. Now, again, a survey. This was done by Anderson. I chose what the top 10 errors are that are made within Excel. Okay, I will not ask you to hold your hands up. It never works very well in these kind of situations because people don't want to admit it. But you know, and I know that you know, that some of you, all of you, have made one or more of these particular mistakes. So if this is the likelihood of making a mistake, what's the real impact of those mistakes? So I'll give you a couple of examples. Kodak, you know well, they reported that someone in their organization made a mistake on a spreadsheet. It led to a severance payout of 7.5 million. Okay? They never got it. Bad luck for the employee. But it's just a really simple example of a very quick and very easy mistake to make. Another example, slightly closer to home this time, London Olympics 2012. Human error in a spreadsheet led to the synchronized swimming being oversold by 10,000 tickets. Okay, so bad for brand, bad for expense, probably not good for job security. Now, there were a few who were very lucky to be upgraded to the 100 metres final, but wasn't me. It may not have been you either. But you can start to see there's a pattern here. Let's look very quickly at inefficiency and poor control. When looking at controlling personal data, and I'm using personal data as in the Data Protection Act, it generally falls into two distinct categories. One is data that is managed by you, by HR teams centrally. But the other one, it's a bit like the dark side of the internet, not quite as bad, I must admit. But secondly, data that is kept locally by managers and other people within your organizations. Okay? I won't ask you to admit that one either. So what do I mean? You know, I've been a manager in a business. I've worked with managers and businesses. If they don't have access to good, reliable data, if they can't get what they need, they'll create their own databases. And guess where they keep them? In Excel spreadsheets. I run quite a few sessions with clients, what I call analysis sessions, which is not lie on a couch, but this is the kind of business understanding sessions. And when I go through, I talk to the HR teams, but then I also talk to the managers and people who are actually needing this data to enable them to do their job. And every single time, they're holding data either in paper or Excel. And that's a challenge because it's often out of date. It's not relevant. We're kind of remembering these terms from the data processing agreement. So, and also is unsecured. Now, this risk increases disproportionately when you bring the multis in. So the multi-location, multi-country, multi-language, multi-currency. Your control over that data decreases dramatically. And as you'll see from the previous slide, compliance, and also on this slide now, compliance is a key component within both of these scenarios, human error and also looking at inefficiency and control. So let's look a little bit more about compliance. Funny enough, with compliance, you're either compliant or you're not. The ICO, Information Commissioner's Office, does not own a grey pen. You're either compliant or you're not. Now, to demonstrate that, they actually fined 11 charities last year. Okay, Great Ormond Street, for example, was fined £11,000. They don't mind who you are. They just want to make sure that data compliance happens. To talk about a slightly bigger impact for data compliance, some of you may remember, if you read the papers a couple of years ago, the London whale, which was JP Morgan Chase. They ended up with fines, plus they also ended up with a cost of 3.7 billion because of pasting or cutting and pasting errors within their organisation. That was part of the challenge they had. And my main point here is that non-compliance, it costs. It costs today, and you know that. But under GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, coming into force next year, under a year, 25th of May next year, it's going to cost you an awful lot more. As fines will be directly related, not just to a ceilinged amount, but it will be related to your group company turnover. That will have more impact. So when we look at data protection, let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail with regards to GDPR. Now, GDPR, under the current Data Protection Act, the onus is on the data controller to ensure that they are compliant. In less than 1 year, with GDPR being introduced, this goes one step further and introduces some new concepts that change significantly the relationship between you as an employer, your employees, and their data. So let's have a look at them. Just to choose a couple. Data subjects, which are either your employees or contractors, will have increased rights and, I think this is the important bit, are likely to use those rights to challenge any decision that has an impact on them. So you can easily see, I was talking about managers having access to information. You can see a situation where an organisation could be treating an employee unfairly, actually using out-of-date, non-compliant data that was managed locally by their manager and not up-to-date information that was held centrally within the HR system. The Data Protection by Design and Default. Great title. But what it means is that organisations are required to conduct risk assessments in far greater detail about their policies, their processes, and their systems. In other words, where is your data? Who has it? How do you make sure it's updated? How do you make sure it's compliant? And how do you make sure it's safe? Now, I don't know about you, but when we do our GDPR compliance audits, I am not going to be defending myself or spreadsheets in that particular process. I will not be using spreadsheets for that. Now, the concept of accountability. This takes the whole process to a different level, requiring employers to be able to demonstrate that compliance, but through a data register, which records how much personal data, how it's being used, and how it's being processed, to be recorded within their organisation to be then able to be audited. Now, for me, I think that's difficult enough using a centralised HR system. I think that's going to be a nightmare when you're thinking about the other 5,000 databases you've got in your organisation. Half of them on email or written emails, and the rest of it sitting on a laptop or a desktop somewhere with a manager. So quite honestly, I rest my case. What we've looked at today are the main elements of the business case. So we've looked at human error, why, and how easy it is. We've looked at inefficiency and poor control, and we've looked at compliance. And I think you may agree with me that each of the first two lead into the last one. And the last one is the one that's going to hurt you the most. It's going to be the biggest concern for organisations today. So I hope that I've made you think a little bit about how your business operates today, and whether, when you compare yourself to the GDPR requirements that are going to be in place in less than 1 year, whether you are red, amber, or green. So, from a Talentia point of view, we have been providing HR systems for over 30 years. And if you'd like to come and see us, find out a little bit about what we do, how we've been able to keep our clients green, then we're very happy to talk to you. We're on stand H120, which is just down the hall there. Okay? We also have the white paper, if you're interested, that we put together. I think you'd find it useful to refer back to in your organisations, and that's available from some of my colleagues who are stood outside the booths as well. We will let you pass. If you don't want one, that is fine. Okay? So that is, for me, the end of the talk. I hope you have found that useful as a reference point to what's going on in the world, and I hope you also agree with me that Excel and HR are foe, not friend. Thank you very much.